At 4:30 in the morning, while Chicago was still frozen in silence, a man's heart stopped beating in a hospital trauma room. The surgeons were standing right there, the machines were screaming, and no one moved except the woman holding a mop. They called her a janitor. They said she didn't belong there. They never asked why her hands didn't shake when everyone else froze. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Chicago in early February was not a city so much as a test of endurance. The wind came off Lake Michigan like an accusation, sharp and personal, slicing through wool coats and bone alike. Snow had fallen all night, heavy and wet, turning sidewalks into uneven fields of ice and slush. The sky hung low and colorless, a ceiling of dirty cotton that pressed down on everything beneath it. In weather like this, the city did not invite kindness. It demanded survival. St. Augustine Mercy Hospital rose from the gray streets like a tired old soldier refusing to lie down. Built in the 1950s, its brick facade was permanently stained by decades of exhaust, salt, and neglect. The windows were narrow and uneven, some glowing dimly, others dark like missing teeth. It was not a beautiful building, but it was a necessary one. Then people came here when life cracked open and there was nowhere else to go. At 4:32 a.m., before the sun even considered showing itself, Margaret Hale pushed through the staff entrance at the rear of the hospital. She was average height, maybe 5'6", with a body that had grown lean not from fitness but from long years of work that demanded more than it gave back. Her shoulders curved slightly forward, as if she were bracing against an invisible weight. Her hair, once a deep chestnut, had faded into a muted brown, threaded with gray, pulled into a low, practical bun that never fully held. A faint scar ran along her left jawline, thin and pale, disappearing beneath her collar, easy to miss unless you knew how to look. Her face was the kind people forgot 5 minutes after seeing it. Not because it lacked character, but because it held no invitation. Her eyes were a cool, observant gray, framed by fine lines that spoke of exhaustion rather than age. She rarely smiled, not out of bitterness, but because smiling had once meant reassurance, and reassurance had become a luxury she no longer trusted. To the hospital staff, she was Mags. Sometimes, hey. Often nothing at all. Margaret signed in at the security desk without looking up. The guard, a young man with headphones dangling around his neck, barely glanced at her badge. He never did. She had been here long enough to blend into the building itself, another fixture like the flickering lights or the humming vents. She took her cart from the supply room, mop, bucket, disinfectant, folded caution signs. The routine grounded her. Each movement was precise, economical, learned through repetition rather than instruction. She began on the second floor, surgical recovery, where the floors needed the most attention and the least acknowledgement. Hospitals at this hour were a strange in-between world. Machines breathed for people who could not. Hallway lights buzzed softly. Somewhere down the corridor, a patient moaned in their sleep. Margaret moved through it all quietly, her rubber soles barely making a sound on the linoleum. She noticed things. She noticed the way an intern skipped the sink outside recovery room 12, rubbing sanitizer on dry hands instead of washing properly. She noticed a half-closed sharps container filled beyond its limit. She noticed that one of the IV pumps was alarming too frequently, not because the patient was in distress, but because the line had been kinked by a careless bed adjustment. Margaret did not report these things, not anymore. She cataloged them silently, filed them away in the same place she kept everything else that mattered. Halfway down the corridor, a nurse stepped out of a patient room and nearly collided with her cart. "Sorry," the nurse said quickly, already turning away. Margaret nodded, though the woman wasn't looking. The nurse's name was Sarah Collins, though most people called her S.C. She was in her late 30s, tall and slightly underweight, with sharp cheekbones and perpetually tired blue eyes. Her blonde hair was pulled into a high ponytail that swung when she walked too fast, which was almost always. There was a rigidity to Sarah's posture, a tension that never quite left her shoulders. Former Army nurse, Afghanistan. Our 2 tours. She had learned to move quickly because hesitation, once, had cost her someone she loved. Sarah noticed Margaret more than most. Not enough to ask questions, but enough to offer a nod, sometimes a quiet, "Morning, Mags." It was the closest thing to kindness Margaret allowed herself to accept. As Sarah disappeared into the stairwell, Margaret continued mopping, the smell of disinfectant sharp in the air. It reminded her, uncomfortably, of iodine and field tents and blood that never fully washed out. Down the hall, laughter erupted. It came from the trauma bay entrance, where Dr. Colin Reeves stood with two residents, coffee in hand, white coat immaculate despite the hour. Reeves was 38, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair styled just messy enough to look effortless. His beard was trimmed to perfection, and more fashion than function, framing a face that had learned how to smile for cameras. He had the kind of confidence that came from being praised early and often, from never having been forced to sit with uncertainty too long. "Relax," Reeves was saying, his voice warm and amused. "If it's still breathing when it gets here, we'll fix it." The residents laughed, eager and relieved. Margaret slowed her steps without realizing it. She watched Reeves gesture with his coffee cup, sloshing dark liquid dangerously close to the rim. He had steady hands when he wanted them steady. She had seen them shake when things went wrong. Reeves glanced down the hall and caught sight of her. His smile flickered, not in recognition, but in irritation. "Careful with that floor," he called out. "Would hate to slip before saving lives." Margaret inclined her head. "Yes, doctor." Her voice was low, even, unremarkable, the kind that disappeared into rooms without leaving a trace. Reeves turned back to his audience, already done with her. Margaret resumed mopping. Her left hip ached, a deep, familiar pain that flared in cold weather. She adjusted her stance, compensating the way she always did. The limp was slight but permanent, earned in a place far from Chicago, under a sun that burned instead of froze. At the end of the hall, she stopped near a window. Outside, snow whipped sideways, obscuring the street below. A city bus crawled past, tires fighting for traction. People moved hunched and hurried, faces hidden beneath scarves and hoods. Margaret rested her hands on the mop handle and allowed herself one slow breath. If this city was hard, this life was smaller than the one she'd lost. But it was quiet, and quiet, for now, was safe. She did not know, could not know, that before the night ended, the silence would be shattered, that a man would stop breathing, that hands trained for war would remember what they were made to do, that the woman the city forgot would step out of the shadows and remind it, violently, what survival truly looked like. For now, she was just Margaret Hale, and the floor still needed cleaning. By the time the first ambulance siren cut through the Chicago wind, the hospital had already shifted its weight. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to those who lived inside its walls, St. Augustine Mercy had a way of tightening before impact, like a body bracing itself for pain. The automatic doors at the emergency entrance hissed open and shut more frequently. Overhead, lights burned a little brighter, voices sharpened. Margaret Hale was on the third-floor stairwell when the call came over the intercom. "Trauma alert, incoming in 5. The voice was calm, trained, deliberately neutral, the kind of voice that pretended emergencies could be contained by tone alone. She paused on the landing, one gloved hand resting against the cold metal railing. Her hip protested, a low, grinding ache that flared whenever she stopped too suddenly. She waited until the pain settled into something manageable, then continued down, pushing her cart ahead of her with controlled effort. She had learned long ago that pain could be negotiated with, if not defeated. On the ground floor, the emergency department was already alive with movement. Gurneys were repositioned, monitors rolled into place, gloves snapped on. The smell changed too, less disinfectant, more adrenaline, metallic and sharp. Margaret angled her cart toward the far wall, out of the way but close enough to see. She never hovered. She had learned how much attention hovering attracted. The ambulance doors burst open moments later. Snow blew in with the paramedics, clinging to their jackets, melting instantly into dirty water on the tile. "Male, mid-20s," one of them shouted. "Crush injury to the chest." Prolonged extrication, BP unstable, pulse thready. The patient was pale beneath streaks of soot and dust, his turnout gear cut away in rough strips. His face was youthful, too young for the weight of his injuries, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. His chest rose unevenly, each breath a visible struggle. Margaret felt it then, the familiar tightening behind her ribs, the involuntary cataloging that began without her consent. Mechanism of injury, skin tone, respiratory effort. She stopped herself, forced her gaze down to the floor as the gurney raced past. She was not here for this. She reminded herself of that every day. "Room 3, someone called. "Move! Move!" Dr. Colin Reeves appeared as if summoned by the noise, striding into the bay with the confidence of a man who believed chaos existed for him to conquer. His white coat fluttered behind him, untouched by blood or grime, and his expression was alert, focused, but edged with something harder to define, anticipation perhaps, the performance of urgency. "All right," Reeves said, clapping his hands once. "Let's get him on the monitor. I want imaging as soon as he's stable." Behind him followed 2 residents, wide-eyed and eager, and a respiratory therapist Margaret had seen before but never learned the name of. She recognized fear when she saw it. It wore many disguises. From the doorway, Sarah Collins watched the scene unfold. She moved with purpose, slipping into place at the head of the bed, her long frame bending efficiently over the patient. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and steady. "Ethan, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can." There was no panic in her tone. Yes, but there was urgency beneath it, the kind earned through repetition. Ethan Brooks did not squeeze. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, and his lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Margaret set her caution sign near the entrance, hands steady, though her pulse had begun to quicken. She told herself it was the cold. It was always easier to blame the cold. Reeves leaned over the patient, listening, watching the monitor flicker. "Blood pressure's dropping," he muttered. "Let's get a line in. Fluids now." Margaret watched his hands. They moved quickly, decisively. But there was a tightness in his shoulders that hadn't been there earlier. His jaw clenched as the monitor alarmed again. "What do you see?" Reeves asked, glancing at the ultrasound screen. The resident hesitated. There's fluid, but—" "Spit it out," Reeves snapped. Margaret's fingers curled around the handle of her cart. She knew what the hesitation meant. She had heard it before, in tents and trucks and half-lit rooms where decisions were measured in seconds. Sarah's eyes flicked from the monitor to Reeves. "His neck veins," she said quietly. "There—" "Give him oxygen," Reeves interrupted. "We'll reassess." Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her, heavy and unwelcome. The world narrowed, sounds sharpening, while everything else dulled. She recognized the sensation even as she fought it. This was the feeling she had sworn never to chase again. The monitor screamed. "Pulse is fading," someone said. Reeves cursed under his breath. "Prep for intubation." Margaret took a step forward before she realized she was moving. She stopped herself just as quickly, the cart bumping softly against the wall. Her heart pounded, loud in her ears. "Not yet," she told herself. "Not your place." But then Ethan's chest stilled, his breath hitching into nothing. The flat tone began its relentless cry. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Reeves froze. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't obvious. His hands simply stopped, hovering uncertainly, as if the air had thickened around them. His eyes darted to the monitor, then to the patient, then back again. He swallowed. "Start compressions," he said too quickly. Sarah reacted instantly, climbing onto the stool, her arms locking as she began the rhythm she knew by heart. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp, searching. Margaret's breath came shallow. She could see it now, clear as a diagram burned into memory. The subtle bulge, the pressure building where it had nowhere to go. Electricity would not fix this. Force would not fix this. She looked at Reeves again. He was speaking, issuing orders, but his voice carried a faint tremor. His confidence had cracked, just enough for someone who knew how to look. In the corner of the room, near the crash cart, stood a hospital security officer Margaret had seen many times before. His name badge read Tom Larkin. He was in his early 50s, stocky, with a graying mustache and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much and been thanked too little. He shifted his weight uneasily, hand resting near his radio. He did not like unpredictability. It reminded him of the night his brother hadn't come home. Margaret met Sarah's gaze across the room. For a heartbeat, nothing passed between them but shared recognition. Then Sarah's eyes widened, just slightly. Then the monitor screamed again. Margaret did not remember deciding to move. She remembered the sound of the mop handle hitting the floor. The clatter seemed impossibly loud, echoing through the room. Heads turned. Reeves looked up, irritation flashing across his face. "Hey!" he barked. "You can't be in here." Margaret stepped forward anyway. Her voice, when it came, surprised even her. "He's not oxygen-starved," she said. "His heart's being compressed." Reeves stared at her as if she'd spoken another language. "Excuse me?" "Fluid around the heart," Margaret continued, the words falling into place with terrible ease. "You won't shock your way out of it." For a moment, the room was silent except for the monitor and Sarah's compressions. Then Reeves laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "Security," he said, without looking away from Margaret. Get her out of here." Tom Larkin hesitated. He glanced from Reeves to the woman in the janitor's uniform, then to the patient whose life hung visibly in the balance. He had learned, long ago, that rules were clear, but situations rarely were. Margaret stood her ground. Her heart hammered, but her hands were steady at her sides. She knew the cost of speaking now. She also knew the cost of staying silent. "This is your last chance," Reeves said, his voice rising. "You're way out of line." Margaret did not answer him. She looked at Sarah instead. And Sarah, former Army nurse, survivor of too many nights like this, made a decision that would change all of their lives. She slowed her compressions just enough to look at Margaret fully. "What do you need?" she asked. The words landed like a bell tolling. Margaret closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Then she opened them. "Access," she said. "Now." The room held its breath. Outside, the snow kept falling, indifferent and relentless, blanketing the city in white. Inside, in Trauma Room 3, the line between janitor and surgeon, between past and present, had begun to dissolve, and there would be no turning back. The room did not explode into motion so much as it tilted, as if the world itself had shifted, and everyone inside Trauma Room 3 had to decide whether to fall or steady themselves. Margaret Hale stepped forward, and with that single step, the years she had spent erasing herself seemed to peel away. The yellow mop bucket stood abandoned near the wall, its plastic sides smeared with gray water, a quiet witness to a choice already made. "Access," she repeated, more firmly now. "Left chest, we don't have time." Dr. Colin Reeves stared at her, disbelief hardening into anger. Up close, the careful symmetry of his face felt brittle, like porcelain under stress. His beard framed his jaw neatly, but sweat had begun to bead along his upper lip. "This is insane," he snapped. "You're not licensed. You're not scrubbed. Get her out." Tom Larkin, the security officer, took a hesitant step forward. He was broad and solid, built like a retired linebacker, but his eyes flicked again to the patient. Ethan Brooks lay motionless, Sarah Collins still compressing his chest with mechanical precision. Each push produced a dull, hollow sound that made Margaret's stomach tighten. She had heard that sound too many times. It meant the heart was trying to beat against a prison. "Tom," Sarah said without looking up. Her voice was tight but controlled. "Give us a minute." "A minute?" Reeves barked. "He's dead." Margaret shook her head. "He's not," she said. "Not yet." The certainty in her tone cut through the shouting. It wasn't loud. It didn't beg. It simply existed, solid and immovable. Reeves hesitated, just long enough for doubt to creep in. He hated that doubt. It reminded him of the first time he'd lost a patient, the first time confidence alone hadn't been enough. "Scalpel," Margaret said. No one moved. Sarah met Margaret's eyes again. In that look lived shared memory, though they had never spoken of it. Triage tents, dust, decisions made with blood on your hands and no time to ask permission. Sarah broke eye contact first and reached for the instrument tray. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she placed the scalpel into Margaret's waiting hand. The weight of it felt familiar, comforting even. Margaret adjusted her grip automatically, her thumb and forefinger finding the balance point, without conscious thought. She did not look at Reeves. She did not look at Tom. Her world narrowed to the still body on the table and the work that needed to be done. "Prep suction," she said. And someone cut the shirt higher. A young resident, pale and wide-eyed, obeyed without thinking. He would later swear he didn't know why he listened, only that something in her voice left no room for argument. Reeves took a step back, color draining from his face. "This is on you," he muttered. "Every second of it." Margaret didn't respond. She placed the blade against Ethan's chest, just left of the sternum. She paused, not from fear, but from respect. A fraction of a second to acknowledge the life beneath her hands. Then she cut. The incision was swift and clean. Blood welled immediately, dark and urgent. The smell changed, sharp and unmistakable. Sarah repositioned without being told, suction roaring to life. The resident handed over retractors with shaking hands. Margaret worked with brutal efficiency. There was no elegance here, no room for finesse. This was not a teaching hospital demonstration. This was war medicine transplanted into tile and fluorescent light. As the ribs spread, the problem revealed itself exactly as Margaret had known it would. The pericardial sac bulged, tight and angry, suffocating the heart within. She felt a flash of grim vindication, not satisfaction, but relief that the enemy had shown itself clearly. "Scissors," she said. Sarah passed them. Their fingers brushed. Sarah's skin was cold. Margaret cut into the sac. Blood burst free, splattering her gloves and sleeves, hot against the chill of the room. Pressure released in an instant, like a held breath finally exhaled. The heart lay exposed now, swollen and still, a terrible, beautiful thing. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Margaret reached in. The heart was warm beneath her palm, it heavier than memory had prepared her for. She began compressions, slower and deeper than those performed on the chest, her rhythm steady and unyielding. "Come on," she murmured, so softly it was almost a thought. "You don't get to quit." The monitor flickered. Reeves pressed himself against the far counter, his mouth slightly open. He had never seen anything like this outside of textbooks and controlled simulations. This was raw, visceral, unforgiving. This was surgery without safety rails. "Internal paddles," Margaret said. Sarah didn't hesitate. She placed them into Margaret's hands, her jaw set. "Clear." The shock jolted the body. Margaret watched the heart intently, her breath held. Nothing. Again. "Clear." This time there was a twitch, a shudder, then a weak, faltering contraction. "Again," Margaret said, urgency creeping into her voice for the first time. The third shock landed, and the heart answered. A stronger beat, then another. The monitor responded with a rising tone, chaotic at first, then gradually settling into something recognizable. Sarah let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "We've got rhythm," she said. "We've got a pulse." The room exhaled. Margaret did not stop. She clamped a small bleeder with practiced precision, then began suturing, her hands steady despite the tremor that threatened at the edges. Her jumpsuit was soaked now, heavy with blood, but she barely noticed. This was the part she trusted. Thread, needle, pressure, order restored one stitch at a time. Reeves watched, stunned, his anger dissolving into something uglier, fear. He saw his authority slipping, not because she had taken it, but because she had earned it in front of everyone. After what felt like hours but was barely 15 minutes, Margaret stepped back. "Chest tube," she said. "ICU, now." The team moved, momentum reclaimed. Someone draped the patient. Someone called ahead. The machinery of the hospital resumed its familiar hum, as if trying to pretend this rupture had never occurred. Margaret removed her gloves slowly. Her hands were streaked red beneath the latex, the lines of her palms filled with blood. She stared at them for a moment, detached, then wiped them on a towel. She turned to leave. "Wait," Sarah said. Margaret paused but did not turn around. "He's stable," Sarah continued, voice thick. "You saved him." Margaret nodded once. "He saved himself," she said quietly. "I just reminded his heart how." Behind them, Reeves found his voice again. "Me, you can't just walk away," he said, sharp and brittle. "You assaulted a physician. You performed an illegal procedure." Margaret finally looked at him. Up close, she could see the fractures in his composure, the places where certainty had been propped up rather than built. "You froze," she said, not unkindly. "People do. It doesn't make you evil, but lying about it will." Reeves flushed. "Security," he snapped. "Stop her." Tom Larkin hesitated only a second longer before stepping aside. He caught Margaret's eye as she passed. There was something like apology there, or gratitude. It was hard to tell. Margaret pushed through the doors into the hallway. The sounds of the trauma bay dulled behind her, replaced by the familiar buzz of lights and distant footsteps. Her hips screamed now, the adrenaline fading. pain rushing in to claim its due. As she leaned briefly against the wall, breathing through it, blood dripped from her sleeve onto the polished floor, each drop a small, dark punctuation mark. She picked up her mop. As she began to clean, she did not see the phone raised behind her. She did not hear the quiet click of a camera beginning to record. She did not know that the life she had saved would become a weapon used against her. All she knew was that a heart was beating that hadn't been moments before, and that the past, long buried, had finally found its way back to the surface. Morning arrived in Chicago like an interrogation light, too bright, too sudden, and deeply unkind. Snow had stopped falling sometime before dawn, leaving the streets glazed and treacherous, the city wrapped in a deceptive stillness. Inside St. Augustine Mercy Hospital, that stillness did not exist. It had been replaced by whispers that moved faster than people, by glances that lingered just long enough to feel accusatory. Margaret Hale clocked in at 6:58 a.m. Her name appeared on the screen, green and unremarkable. Environmental Services. Nothing about it suggested blood or bone or the sound a heart made when it came back to life. She took her card as usual. No one stopped her. No one said thank you. But they watched. Nurses who had nodded at her yesterday now looked away. A pair of residents whispered near the elevators, their eyes tracking her progress down the hall. Margaret felt it like a change in barometric pressure, subtle but unmistakable. The story had already begun to form, even before it had words. In the staff lounge, a television mounted high on the wall played the local morning news. The volume was low, but the chyron burned bright. Hospital incident under investigation. Margaret didn't stop walking, but her reflection flickered across the darkened screen as she passed. A woman in a janitor's uniform, blood on her sleeves, a scalpel in her hand. The footage was grainy and cropped tight, filmed vertically on a phone. It showed chaos without context, sound without sense. It showed her stepping toward the bed. It did not show Dr. Reeves freezing. It did not show Sarah's hands shaking as she performed compressions. Yes, it did not show the heart beginning to beat again. It showed what people were ready to believe. By the time Margaret reached the ICU floor, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She rarely carried it turned on. This morning, it would not stop buzzing. Unknown numbers, missed calls, a text message from a number she didn't recognize. Is this you? Another? They're saying you attacked a doctor. Another, colder still. You should have stayed buried. She slipped the phone back into her pocket without replying. Outside, ICU room 7. Sarah Collins stood rigid, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had changed out of her scrubs, but the fatigue clung to her anyway. Her blonde ponytail had loosened, strands falling around her face, and her eyes were rimmed red, not from tears, but from rage carefully contained. You shouldn't be here, Sarah said quietly when she saw Margaret. I mop here, Margaret replied. Her voice was neutral, but the words tasted strange now. They're looking for you, Sarah said. Administration, legal. Reeves is telling anyone who will listen that you assaulted him. Margaret nodded once. Did Ethan? He's alive, Sarah cut in, sedated but stable. His parents are on their way. Margaret exhaled slowly. Relief was a dangerous thing. It softened you. She had learned that the hard way. Before either of them could say more, the elevator doors opened behind them. Dr. Harold Myers stepped out, flanked by 2 hospital administrators. Myers was in his early 60s, tall and gaunt, with silver hair combed neatly back and wire-rimmed glasses perched permanently on his nose. He had once been a surgeon himself, long before politics had taught him safer ways to wield power. These days, he preferred corridors and committees to operating rooms. Margaret, Myers said, his tone carefully measured, we need to talk. The administrators beside him, a woman in a navy suit and a man with an anxious sheen of sweat, did not introduce themselves. They didn't need to. Their presence said enough. Now? Margaret asked. Yes, Myers said. Now. Sarah took a step forward. She hasn't done anything wrong. Myers didn't look at her. That's not for you to decide. They escorted Margaret to a small conference room near the administrative offices. It smelled faintly of coffee and stale carpet cleaner. No windows, a long table, 3 chairs on one side, one on the other. Margaret sat alone. Dr. Reeves arrived moments later, his right wrist wrapped in a white brace that hadn't been there an hour earlier. He moved stiffly, favoring it as if it were more injured than it was. His beard had been trimmed again, sharper now, his hair immaculate. He did not look at Margaret. "This is a serious matter," the woman in the navy suit began. "You performed an invasive medical procedure without credentials, authorization, or consent." "You filmed me," Margaret said calmly, looking at Reeves. Reeves stiffened. "I documented a threat." "You documented your fear," Margaret replied. "There's a difference." Myers cleared his throat. "Enough. Margaret, effective immediately. You are suspended pending investigation." "Suspended from mopping?" Margaret asked, not unkindly. The man beside the woman flinched. Reeves did not. "There are criminal implications here," Reeves said, finding his confidence again. "You put a patient at risk." Sarah burst into the room then, uninvited and unapologetic. "That's a lie." Myers turned sharply. "Nurse Collins?" "He was dead," Sarah said, her voice shaking now, but loud. "Clinically dead. She brought him back." Reeves slammed his good hand on the table. "You're emotional. You're compromised." Sarah laughed, sharp and humorless. "You froze." The room went silent. Myers rubbed his temple. "This conversation is over," he said. "Security will escort Margaret off the premises." Margaret stood. Her hips screamed, but she did not show it. She met Sarah's eyes, something unspoken passing between them. Gratitude, perhaps, or warning. In the hallway, Tom Larkin waited, radio clipped to his belt. He wouldn't meet her gaze. "I'm sorry," he said quietly as he walked her toward the exit. "And orders." "I know," Margaret said. Outside, the cold hit her like a slap. The city had fully woken now. Cars honked, people hurried past, oblivious. Somewhere above her, a helicopter hovered, the thrum vibrating in her bones. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she answered. "Yes," she said. A man's voice came through, smooth and practiced. "Ms. Hale, this is Detective Marcus Bell with Chicago PD. We'd like to ask you a few questions about last night's incident." Margaret closed her eyes. Across town, in a quiet ICU waiting room, Robert Brooks sat alone. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with a graying beard and eyes that missed nothing. A judge by profession, he wore his authority lightly, but it had been forged by decades of listening more than speaking. He had arrived before dawn and had not left his son's bedside since. Guess on the television across the room, the same footage played again. Robert frowned. He replayed it on his phone, slowed it down, watched the way the woman moved, the way she stood her ground, the way the doctor recoiled. This was not the behavior of someone unhinged. This was competence. He turned off the screen and stood. Stories he knew were dangerous things, especially the ones everyone agreed on too quickly. Robert Brooks had learned, over 3 decades on the bench, that truth rarely announced itself. It hid in margins, in pauses, in the places people rushed past because they were inconvenient. By the time the sun cleared the skyline, casting pale winter light through the ICU windows, he had already decided that the story being told about the woman in the janitor's uniform was incomplete. Ethan lay sedated in ICU room 7, machines breathing and blinking in steady rhythms. The bruising along his chest was deepening into shades of purple and green, but his vitals were strong. Robert stood beside the bed, one large hand resting on the rail, his other tucked into the pocket of his coat. He was a tall man, solidly built, with the posture of someone who had never needed to announce authority for it to be felt. His beard, once dark, had gone mostly gray, trimmed close in a way that suggested discipline rather than vanity. His eyes, brown, observant, and patient, missed very little. He replayed the video again on his phone, this time without sound. He slowed it, frame by frame. He watched the way Dr. Reeves's hands hovered uselessly. The way the nurse, Sarah Collins, he now knew her name, moved with purpose. And most of all, he watched the woman everyone was calling dangerous. She did not flail. She did not hesitate. She stepped forward like someone stepping into a role she had never stopped carrying. Robert exhaled slowly. "Judges see patterns," his late wife used to say. "That's why people hate them." He had laughed then. Now the words rang uncomfortably true. He turned off the phone and looked up as a man in scrubs entered the waiting area. Dr. Alan Whitaker, as cardiothoracic consult, mid-40s, narrow frame, receding hairline, and eyes permanently shadowed by lack of sleep. Whitaker was known for competence rather than charm. He did not play politics well, which was why he was rarely invited to do so. "Your son's recovery is remarkable," Whitaker said quietly. Another few minutes, and we would have been having a very different conversation. Robert nodded. "Who performed the intervention?" Whitaker hesitated. "Officially, Dr. Reeves's team." "And unofficially?" Robert asked. Whitaker met his gaze. "You already know the answer." Robert thanked him and waited until he was alone again before making the first call. Across the city, Margaret Hale sat in the back of a police car, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She had refused cuffs, and Detective Marcus Bell, and after one look at her gait and the exhaustion etched into her face, had agreed. Bell was in his early 40s, lean and sharp-featured, with closely cropped hair and the wary eyes of someone who had learned not to trust first impressions. He had grown up on the South Side, the son of a paramedic who drank himself into silence. People who were painted as monsters interested him. They often weren't. "You understand you're not under arrest," Bell said as they drove. "Yet," Margaret nodded. "I understand." They pulled into the precinct just after 8. Margaret walked slowly, her hip burning with each step. But she did not ask for help. Bell noticed. He always noticed things like that. In the interview room, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Bell sat across from her, notebook open. "Why were you in the trauma bay?" Margaret answered plainly. No embellishment, no defense. She explained what she saw, what she knew, what she did. She did not name her past. She did not ask for understanding. Bell listened without interrupting. When she finished, he closed his notebook. "You're saying you performed an emergency thoracotomy?" "Yes." "And you've done this before?" "Yes." "Where?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "In places where permission was a luxury." Bell studied her for a long moment. "You know Dr. Reeves has already contacted the DA." "I assumed he would." "Why?" "Because fear looks for cover," Margaret said, "and I took his." Bell leaned back. He had interviewed enough liars to recognize the choreography. Margaret Hale did not move like one of them. Meanwhile, in a quiet office overlooking the river, out Robert Brooks met with his longtime clerk, Eleanor Price. Eleanor was in her early 60s, petite, sharp-tongued, and incapable of missing a detail. Her silver hair was cut short, practical, and her glasses perched perpetually at the end of her nose. "She's been erased before," Eleanor said, scanning the documents Robert had pulled. Medical board records, military inquiry, everything sealed or redacted. "Someone wanted her gone," Robert said. "Someone powerful," Eleanor replied. "And someone with friends?" Robert nodded. "Get me everything you can on Dr. Colin Reeves." Eleanor smiled thinly. "Already started." By noon, the narrative had hardened. News vans lined the hospital entrance. Headlines sharpened. Margaret Hale was no longer a woman who acted in a crisis. She was a threat that had been stopped. Reeves appeared on camera with his wrist brace and rehearsed concern. "I was terrified," he said, voice perfectly calibrated. "For my patient, for my staff." Robert watched from his office, jaw clenched. That afternoon, Detective Bell released Margaret. "For now," he said, "don't leave the city." "I won't," Margaret replied. She didn't mention she had nowhere to go. She walked instead, the cold biting through her coat, past storefronts and bus stops, and people who glanced at her face and then away again. At a small park near the river, she sat on a bench, breath fogging the air. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered. "Margaret Hale." "Ms. Hale," Robert Brooks said. "My name is Robert Brooks. I believe you saved my son's life." Silence stretched between them. "I would like to hear your story," he continued. The whole one." Margaret closed her eyes. Snow began to fall again, light and steady, softening the edges of the city. "I don't know if it will help," she said. "I do," Robert replied, "because stories don't end when powerful people say they do." For the first time since the night before, Margaret felt something shift. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of ground beneath her feet. And far away, in an office filled with glass and carefully curated silence, Dr. Colin Reeves realized that the story he had told so confidently was no longer entirely his to control. The building where Robert Brooks worked had been designed to inspire trust. Thick limestone walls, narrow windows, corridors that echoed just enough to remind visitors that their words mattered here. It was the kind of place where truth was supposed to be weighed carefully, not bent. Robert had believed in that once, without reservation. Age had taught him better. Truth, he knew now, survived not because institutions protected it, but because someone refused to let it disappear. Eleanor Price spread the folders across the long oak table in his office with deliberate care. The documents were a patchwork: medical board rulings, sealed military inquiries, redacted witness statements. Some pages were so heavily blacked out they looked like modern art. Others ended abruptly, conclusions missing, like signatures replaced with stamps that said classified or closed without finding. They tried to erase her cleanly, Eleanor said, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. That usually means panic, not confidence. Robert ran a hand through his hair. What was the incident? Eleanor slid a thinner file toward him. Field hospital outside Mosul, 7 years ago. Mass casualty event. Civilian contractors, military personnel. One high-profile casualty tied to a defense subcontractor. Robert skimmed the summary, his jaw tightening. And Margaret Hale? She was lead surgeon on site, Eleanor said. She made a call that contradicted a direct request from a civilian authority embedded with the unit. According to the inquiry, that decision resulted in a death. According to the inquiry, Robert repeated. Eleanor nodded. Every witness who supported her version of events was reassigned within weeks. 2 retired early. 1 died in a single car accident. She paused. Officially unrelated. Robert closed the file. He had seen this pattern before. Not often, but enough. Across the city, Margaret Hale sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, the space barely large enough for 2 chairs and a chipped mug. The building was old, the kind that creaked in protest whenever the wind pushed too hard. She hadn't turned on the heat yet. She didn't like the way it hummed, the way it reminded her of generators that failed at the worst possible moments. Her hip throbbed steadily, a deep ache that had settled into her bones. She pressed her palm against it, breathing through the pain the way she always did, slowly, methodically, counting backward. Pain was familiar. It followed rules. The knock at her door was unexpected. Margaret stiffened, her instincts flaring. She moved quietly, peering through the peephole before unlocking it. Detective Marcus Bell stood in the hallway, coat collar turned up, hands visible and empty. "I'm not here to arrest you," he said immediately. Margaret opened the door wider. "That makes 2 of us relieved," she replied. Bell stepped inside, taking in the sparse room without comment. "You should know," he said. "The DA is under pressure. Hospital board, donors, media." "And Dr. Reeves," Margaret added. Bell nodded. "Him especially." He hesitated, then said, "I pulled your military records, what I could access." Margaret didn't react outwardly, but something tightened behind her ribs. And they don't read like the file of a reckless woman," Bell said. They read like someone who took responsibility when others didn't want it." Margaret looked at him then. Really looked. "Why are you telling me this?" Bell shrugged slightly. "Because my father was a medic, and because I've learned that when a story feels too clean, it usually isn't." He left a card on the table before going. "If anyone comes to you with threats dressed up as offers, call me." After the door closed, Margaret sat for a long time, staring at the card. She had not expected allies. They made things complicated. Meanwhile, Robert Brooks made his first official move. He requested a judicial review of the sealed military inquiry, not publicly, but quietly, through channels that still owed him favors. The response came faster than expected. Denied, no explanation, no justification. Robert smiled thinly. Denial was confirmation. That evening, Sarah Collins sat alone in her car in the hospital parking garage, hands gripping the steering wheel long after she should have driven away. The day had been brutal. Questions from administration, sideways looks from colleagues, an email suggesting she take personal leave. She didn't regret what she'd done. Her phone buzzed, an unfamiliar number. "This is Robert Brooks," the voice said. "You were present during my son's surgery." Sarah straightened. "Yes, sir." "I need a witness," Robert said. "Someone who understands what competent care looks like under pressure." Sarah didn't hesitate. "You have one. Across town, Dr. Colin Reeves poured himself another drink, the amber liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim of the glass. His apartment was modern and immaculate, all steel and glass and carefully chosen art. It was supposed to feel like success. Tonight, it felt exposed. His phone rang. Unknown number. Dr. Reeves, a man's voice said smoothly, I represent parties who are very invested in keeping certain narratives intact. Reeves's grip tightened. I've done everything I was supposed to. We know, the man replied, but stories have a way of slipping. We need you to stay consistent. And if I don't? A pause, just long enough to feel intentional. Then people start asking why your surgical outcomes declined so sharply 3 years ago, and why the board looked the other way. The call ended. Reeves stared at the dark screen, his reflection fractured in the glass. Fear settled in his chest, heavy and suffocating. He had thought he was protected. He was learning the difference between being valued and being expendable. 2 days later, Robert Brooks sat across from Margaret Hale in a quiet law office borrowed for discretion. He looked different here, less like a judge, more like a man who had decided something mattered enough to risk comfort. You were set up, Robert said plainly. Years ago, and again now. Margaret folded her hands on the table. I know. I can bring this to light, Robert continued, but it won't be gentle. They'll question everything, your past, your decisions. They already do, Margaret said. At least this time, it would be for the truth. Robert studied her. Why did you take the fall back then? Margaret's voice was steady, but quieter now. Because the dead don't get second chances, and someone needed to stay clean enough to keep working. Robert nodded slowly. The file wouldn't stay buried, he said. That's usually a sign. Margaret met his gaze. A sign of what? That the story isn't finished, Robert replied. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that a reckoning had begun. Snow melted into slush. Traffic surged. Lives intersected and passed, without noticing the quiet alignment taking place beneath the surface. For the first time in years, Margaret felt the past loosen its grip, not because it had forgiven her, but because it was finally being named. And somewhere deep in the machinery of power, something old and ugly began to stir, aware at last that it was being hunted. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., but by 8:30, the room was already full. Courtroom 14B sat on the 4th floor of the Cook County Judicial Building, a space designed less for drama than for attrition. Pale wood paneling, hard benches, fluorescent lights that flattened faces and stripped emotion down to essentials. This was not a place for speeches meant to inspire. It was a place where stories either survived scrutiny or collapsed under their own weight. Margaret Hale entered quietly through a side door. She wore no uniform, no disguise, just a dark gray coat and a plain blouse beneath it, her hair pulled back with the same functional precision she had used in operating tents half a world away. She walked with a slight limp, more noticeable today, her hips stiff from cold and stress. Still, her posture was straight, yet not defiant. Grounded. Robert Brooks followed a step behind her, carrying a thin leather folder under his arm. He looked composed, but the tension lived in his jaw, in the way his fingers tightened briefly around the folder before relaxing again. He had chosen this room deliberately. Public enough to matter. Controlled enough to keep the truth from being shouted down. Across the aisle, Dr. Colin Reeves sat with his legal team. He looked immaculate, navy suit, crisp white shirt. His beard had been trimmed into softer lines, less severe, more sympathetic. The wrist brace was gone, replaced by a faintly pink wrap that suggested recovery without admitting exaggeration. He did not look at Margaret. Behind Reeves sat 2 men Margaret did not recognize. Older, well-dressed, their expressions carefully neutral. They watched the room the way people watched markets, not moments. Sarah Collins arrived last, slipping into a seat near the back. She wore civilian clothes for the first time since the incident. Jeans and a dark sweater, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. She looked smaller out of scrubs, less armored, but her eyes were steady. She had slept poorly and didn't care who knew it. The judge entered. Proceedings began. The hospital's attorney spoke first, his voice smooth, practiced, laying out a narrative that had already been circulating for days. An emotionally unstable janitorial employee, an unauthorized medical intervention, a respected surgeon placed at risk. Words like protocol, safety, and liability were deployed like shields. When he finished, the room felt heavier. Robert stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not pace. He simply spoke, as if explaining something that should have been obvious all along. He introduced himself not as Ethan's father, but as a judge acting under personal recusal to present evidence of public concern. He acknowledged the hospital's duty of care. Then, calmly, he dismantled the story they had built. He began with timestamps. He moved to footage. He paused where the video had been cut short. The full recording played on the screen mounted at the front of the room. This time, nothing was missing. The audience watched Dr. Reeves hesitate. Watch Sarah's compressions falter as the monitor screamed. Watch Margaret step forward, not wild, not erratic, but deliberate. They watched the incision, the release, the heart returning to motion. There were murmurs now, subtle shifts in posture. A woman in the second row covered her mouth with her hand. Reeves stared straight ahead, face pale. Robert let the footage end before speaking again. "This," he said, "is not an assault. It is an emergency intervention performed by someone who knew exactly what she was doing." The hospital attorney objected. "Credentials, licensing, jurisdiction." Robert nodded. "All valid concerns, which is why we should discuss why someone with this level of competence was cleaning floors." He introduced Margaret then, not with embellishment, not with drama, just facts. Former military surgeon, lead trauma specialist, decorated, discharged under contested circumstances. The sealed file appeared next. Gasps rippled through the room as the redactions faded on the screen, replaced by testimony long buried. Reassignment orders, delayed evacuations, though in a decision overridden by a civilian authority with no medical training. Margaret kept her eyes forward. She did not look at the screen. She did not need to. She had lived those pages. "Mrs. Hale," the judge presiding said gently, "do you wish to speak?" Margaret stood. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I didn't come here to defend myself," she said. "I came here because a man is alive who shouldn't be, and because lies get stronger the longer they're left alone." She described what she saw that night. Not heroics, not sacrifice, just anatomy and timing and consequence. She did not name Reeves. She did not accuse. She simply explained. When she finished, there was silence. Then the judge turned to Sarah Collins. Sarah stood slowly, her hands trembling just enough to notice. "I've been a nurse for 16 years, she said. "I've worked in hospitals and field units. I've watched people die because we waited. What Ms. Hale did was not reckless. It was necessary." The judge nodded and turned to Reeves. "Dr. Reeves?" Reeves stood, smoothing his jacket. For a moment, Margaret almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "This footage doesn't show the full picture," Reeves said. "I was managing multiple variables. I acted in the patient's best interest." "And the deleted footage?" the judge asked. Reeves hesitated. The pause was too long. One of the men behind him leaned forward, just slightly. Reeves exhaled. I was advised." "By whom?" the judge pressed. Reeves' gaze flicked toward the men behind him, then away. "Legal counsel." The judge followed his glance. "Gentlemen?" Neither man spoke. Robert stepped forward again. "No, may I submit additional evidence?" He played the recording Detective Bell had quietly obtained, a phone call. Reeves's voice, fear threaded through it. A reminder of past surgical outcomes quietly buried. The room shifted decisively now. The story cracked. The judge recessed the hearing for deliberation. When they reconvened, the decision was swift. Charges against Margaret Hale were dismissed. An independent investigation into St. Augustine Mercy Hospital was ordered. Dr. Colin Reeves was placed on immediate administrative leave pending review. Margaret sat down slowly, her breath unsteady for the first time all morning. Sarah reached over and squeezed her hand. Outside the courtroom, reporters surged. Questions flew, cameras flashed. Robert intercepted most of it, shielding Margaret with practiced ease. Ethan Brooks stood near the doors, supported by his mother. He was pale, thinner than before, but unmistakably alive. When he saw Margaret, his face softened with recognition. "You're the one," he said simply. Margaret smiled, small and genuine. "You did the hard part." He shook his head. "You didn't let me die." Behind them, Dr. Reeves slipped away through a side corridor, phone pressed to his ear, his world narrowing fast. The masks had fallen, and for the first time in a very long while, Margaret Hale stood in the open, unhidden, her story no longer someone else's to tell. Spring came to Chicago the way forgiveness often does, slowly, without asking permission, and only after the damage had already been done. Snow melted into long, apologetic rivers along the curbs. The lake wind softened, trading its cruelty for restlessness. The city did not become gentle, but it became possible. Margaret Hale noticed these changes because, for the first time in years, she was no longer bracing herself against disappearance. She stood on the sidewalk of South Prairie Avenue, keys cool and solid in her palm, looking up at a narrow brick building that had once been a pawn shop, then a tax office, then nothing at all. The windows were clean now. The paint around the doorframe was new but imperfect, applied by volunteers who had tried their best and left their humanity visible in every uneven stroke. Above the door hung a modest sign, Hale Community Trauma Clinic. No rank, no credentials, no explanations, just a place. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and fresh paint layered over something older. Dust, history, survival. The waiting area held a mismatched collection of chairs donated by churches and closed-down offices. A coffee machine hummed in the corner, temperamental but functional. On the far wall, a bulletin board already sagged beneath flyers. Free vaccinations, grief counseling, food pantry hours. Margaret stepped inside and locked the door behind her. The sound was small but final. Her hip still ached. It always would. But the pain had shifted, no longer a reminder of loss, but of continuity, proof that the body, like the truth, could be damaged and still persist. Down the hall, a voice called out, "You're early." Sarah Collins emerged from one of the exam rooms, sleeves rolled up, blonde hair pulled into a low ponytail that no longer needed regulation. She looked different out of the hospital, less armored, but not less strong. The sharp lines of exhaustion were still there, but they had softened, reshaped by something like choice. "Old habits," Margaret replied. Sarah smiled. "I figured." Sarah had resigned from St. Augustine Mercy 3 weeks after the hearing. The hospital's investigation was ongoing, its reputation unraveling in public. But she hadn't waited for the outcome. She had spent too many years holding systems together that mistook endurance for loyalty. They had found the building together, funded it quietly, through settlements that never made headlines and donations that didn't want credit. And Robert Brooks had handled the legal scaffolding, declining interviews, declining accolades. "Some work," he had said, "should be allowed to speak for itself." Robert stood now in the doorway, watching them with the faint, wry smile of a man who had learned when to step back. His beard was trimmed, his suit replaced by a simple jacket and slacks. He no longer looked like a judge. He looked like a father who slept through the night again. "You ready?" he asked. Margaret nodded. The first patient arrived 10 minutes later. Mrs. Althea Green was 72, small and sharp-eyed, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too big. She smelled faintly of lavender and menthol. Her hands shook when she filled out the intake form, not from fear, but from age and arthritis and years of being told to wait. "I didn't think anyone would see me today," she said softly, settling into the chair. "They usually don't." Margaret knelt in front of her instead of sitting behind the desk. It was an old habit, learned in places where hierarchy wasted time. "You're here," Margaret said. "That's enough for today." Mrs. Green smiled, surprised into it. Word spread quietly. Not through press releases or charity galas, but through bus stops and church basements and the unglamorous networks people built when institutions failed them. The clinic treated knife wounds and infections and fractures that had been ignored too long. It treated fear. It treated shame. It treated the kind of pain that came from being invisible. Margaret worked without ceremony. She did not introduce herself with her past. Those who needed to know learned eventually. Usually when they recognized the way her hands moved, confident, reverent, precise, the hands that remembered. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the front windows, Ethan Brooks walked in. He was thinner than before, his movements careful, but his eyes were clear. He wore no uniform now, just jeans and a jacket, his hair grown out slightly, a scar visible along his collarbone, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. He stopped when he saw Margaret. "Hey," he said. She looked up from cleaning a wound and smiled. "You shouldn't be lifting anything heavy yet." He laughed quietly. "Occupational hazard." He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, himself in his firefighting gear, helmet tucked under one arm, standing beside his crew. On the back, written in careful block letters, "Still here." Margaret closed her fingers around the photo. She didn't trust her voice, so she nodded instead. Across the city, consequences unfolded. Dr. Colin Reeves resigned before the board could finalize its findings. His license was suspended pending review. The men who had advised him disappeared into firms that specialized in silence. St. Augustine Mercy entered a long season of audits and apologies and change that came too late for some and just in time for others. Margaret did not follow the news closely. It no longer belonged to her. One evening, after the clinic closed, she stood alone in the exam room, wiping down the counter. The light above flickered once before steadying. For a moment, she was back in another place, another time. Canvas walls, generator hum, the smell of dust and blood and fear. She breathed through it, and on the wall beside the sink hung a small plaque. No names, no dates, just words, etched simply. Some hands do not forget how to save a heart, even when the world tries to forget them. Margaret turned off the lights and locked the door. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed. Laughter drifted from somewhere down the block. Life continued, imperfect and stubborn. Margaret Hale walked home without looking over her shoulder. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer erased. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Not as a hero, not as a ghost, but as a woman whose hands remembered and who chose every day to use them. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the hands that refuse to give up, in the heart that keeps beating when it shouldn't, in the courage of someone the world chose not to see. Margaret Hale was never meant to be famous. She didn't ask to be forgiven. She didn't ask to be remembered. She simply did what God placed in her hands to do. The Bible tells us that the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And so often, that stone looks like the janitor you pass in the hallway, the nurse who stays late, the stranger who carries pain you'll never know. In our everyday lives, we rush. We judge by titles. We trust uniforms more than hearts. But this story reminds us of something sacred. God works through the overlooked, through broken people, through hands that have known loss and still choose love. If you're watching this and feeling invisible, if you're tired, overlooked, or carrying a burden no one sees, know this: God has not forgotten you. And if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. And if you believe that no one should face fear, pain, or darkness alone, please subscribe to this channel. It helps us continue telling stories of quiet miracles and second chances. May God bless you. May He protect your family. And may He remind you, even on the hardest days, that grace is still at work, often in the most unexpected places. Thank you for watching. You are not alone.